In this screencast, we're going to continue a look at the bits of evidence of and evidence for evolution, which is change over time. And going further with a look at the fossil record, the fossil record is, again, probably the number one collection of data that both shows there has been change over time in the distribution of living things on Earth, and it continues to be the best tool for further study of that. One type of study, or one look using the fossil record, is something called biogeography. Biogeography. And that is specifically looking at the distribution of living things over the planet, both living now and then what the fossil record shows us. And so kind of a look like that, or a look at that, in this map, looking at Pangea, the idea that continents were originally a long time ago in one landmass, it kind of explains some of the trends of populations and distribution of living things across the globe. So biogeography supports evolution in many ways because organisms are not distributed evenly throughout the world, but related organisms are found in the same isolated parts of the world. And interestingly enough, that is not explained totally just by climate. I mean, for example, you could use evolutionary ideas to explain why polar bears would be found in Arctic regions, but they aren't found in Antarctic regions, while, of course, the climates are quite similar. This example, the map here, is showing distributions of different types of species. But we look at different marsupials and the existence of them specifically in Australia. Almost all of the marsupials are only found isolated in Australia, even though there are other places on the globe and on Earth that have similar climates. So as we said, marsupials are mammals that have very small or short gestation times, meaning from fertilization to actual birth is very short, unlike most mammals that we're used to. But they give birth right away, but then the organism is pretty much helpless, has to climb into a pouch to further their development. Well, marsupials are found primarily and almost entirely just on the continent of Australia. There's a couple examples like in South America, but almost all of them, all marsupials are found on Australia, even though there's plenty of other examples across the globe of climates and habitats that would naturally support them. Furthermore, different types of mammals, ones that have long gestation times, which means the long mothers carry them for a long time, and then they give birth to, although almost helpless, they're a lot further along than marsupial births, and there's hardly any indigenous mammals of that sort on the continent of Australia. So this brings us to a type of scientist that would look at these, and as the name implies, evolutionary biologists, they specifically study relationships among organisms. Now they may be similar, yet different species of organisms, and they look at how that could have changed over time. Looking at comparative anatomy, in other words, the structural anatomy from one organism to the next, we look at structures called homologous structures. Homologous structures are essentially they have the same structural form. Perhaps they share, or perhaps they have different functions, but they share the same type of tissue, the same type of skeletal structure from one organism to the next. So simple examples here are these different types of organisms, but the common structures in different organisms are referred to as homologous structures. Likewise, another structure, again speaking in terms of anatomy and structures in different organisms, vestigial organs, or probably a better name is a vestigial structure, But these are things that are functional in some species, but they seemingly are useless in their form in other organisms. There's lots of examples of these from across different populations and different species. One of them would be the appendix. The appendix in humans really doesn't have any digestive function as a part of the GI tract or as a part of the digestive system of humans. The only thing that really does is it still houses useful bacteria, but it doesn't play any digestive functions. Wisdom teeth in humans, really all that they do now is they screw up people's jaws and people's teeth, so that's why a lot of humans have to get them taken out. In whales, they've been found to have pelvic girdles, in other words, having a pelvis. Well, a pelvis certainly doesn't have any use in a whale at all. Other organisms might have eyes that don't function. So there's been reptiles, there's actually been examples of different rodents that actually have eyes, but yet they're either covered by skin or they really don't even have a retina. They don't have the functionality of sight. And so there's a lot of unanswered questions about these. Namely, and simplistically, is why would those structures physically be there if they serve no functional purpose? Embryology is another course of study or a direction of study to study the embryos of different organisms before embryos are developing organisms before they either are born or before they hatch, depending on the organism. But there's a lot of similarities between different organisms that in their development. And so again, not getting into too much detail, it's just that is an avenue or a way of studying relationships in evolution. Perhaps the number one modern technology that is used to study relatedness from species to species, relatedness in the different organisms on Earth, is a molecule called DNA. Now, of course, we've got a new year, we'll put it this way, but you already know quite a bit about DNA. For example, in TV shows, crime scene investigators, CSI shows, if this were a population of human beings, you've all seen this on TV or movies or whatever, you know that we can use DNA samples to help us identify them. For example, if we at a crime scene had a sample of DNA, had some body fluid left behind, namely blood or something, we could get a picture of the DNA of that blood. And if we had certain suspects, we could, like fingerprints, we could match the DNA samples of the suspects to the DNA found at a crime scene, for instance. Or even crazy talk shows where we're trying to find out the father of a child or something. You already know that you can use DNA technology to identify individuals. So you may or may not understand what that molecule is, but DNA is a universal genetic code. All organisms, whether you're a dandelion, a carpenter ant, a cat, a cheetah, a human being, an apple, all living things use this exact same molecule as a defines the characteristics. It defines the traits that they have. So if we're able to take DNA samples and compare them from one individual to the next in humans, we can do the same thing with any living thing. We can get the DNA sequences, in other words, kind of get the fingerprint of morel mushrooms, which are awesome, or spruce trees, or timber wolves, or apple trees, or lions, or tigers, or bears. But for instance, in this example, we can scientifically and empirically show that the DNA fingerprint of lions are quite similar to the DNA fingerprint of tigers. So what that suggests is some sort of relationship, some sort of relatedness. Likewise, believe it or not, the DNA of a tiger, is more similar to a human being than it would be to some single-celled organism or even a spruce tree. So when we're talking about relatedness, we're talking about sections of DNA, and what those sections of DNA are called that we compare are called genes. So you may or may not know different types of genes here, but we want to know biologically or scientifically what the definition of a gene is. A gene is a particular part of DNA, so a certain section of a DNA molecule that actually ends up coding for a trait. So you have genes that determine your actual eye color. You have genes that determine your fingerprints. Flowers have genes that actually determine or code for their color of flowers. So we can talk about a gene pool as being the combination of all the possible genes in a certain population. We've talked about peppered moths before. Peppered moths have genes for their coloration patterns. They might be dark, they might be lighter, or they might be somewhere in between. But a gene pool is all of the collection within a species of possible genes. So humans can combine their genes in a lot of different ways, but it really boils down to only what you would get from your biological mom and your biological dad.